Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Really looking forward to today's conversation with first-time guest Peter Baker of the New York Times. We shall get to Peter in just a second, but first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Peter Baker is the Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst for MSNBC. He has covered the last 5 presidents for the Times and the Washington Post. At the Post, he also served as Moscow co-bureau chief and covered the opening months of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He is author of 7 books, including the best-selling The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021, and The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, both with his wife, Susan Glasser, of The New Yorker. He is a frequent panelist on Washington Week on PBS. Peter, welcome into the back room.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So here we are on a slow news day, huh?
Not much going on. What will we possibly talk about?
Yeah. How about those Knicks, huh? So the big breaking news, we're recording this episode on the day that the Supreme Court announced its ruling on presidential absolute immunity, keyword there. The Trump legal team is claiming this is a major victory. On some level, it would also seem to greenlight Special Counsel Jack Smith's ability to move forward with some of the charges. What's your takeaway from this so far today?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 levels to look at it. One, of course, is the impact on Trump. And number one, it means that there will not be a trial before the election on the election subversion charges. That seems almost impossible to imagine happening between now and then. And so for Trump, that's a victory. It takes it off the table in terms of the election. There will be an evidentiary hearing, and that could be damaging to him, but he won't have a trial with a guilty or not guilty verdict. And B, if he wins, of course, then that prosecution presumably goes away. So in that sense, it is a big victory. The second way to look at it, of course, is the broader point, which goes beyond Trump, Biden, or 2024. It's like we are now in very different territory when it comes to our understanding of our constitutional democracy, because we've never had before a Supreme Court say that a president, sitting or former, has any kind of immunity from criminal prosecution for wrongdoing. And now they've set new limits on that. There's a big disagreement about what it will mean. Just to be clear, obviously, they're saying he has absolute immunity for official acts and not any immunity for personal acts. He can't go out actually on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone without facing possible prosecution. But there's a big middle ground there that's left unclear, which is what constitutes official acts in which he might have the presumption of immunity. And so that's going to take a long time to work out in his particular case. And broadly in the future, it leaves us uncertain about what it is a president really can do without worry of prosecution.
And that's all true. And that's an excellent summary of the macro sense of it on both the Trump and future levels. And what frightens me the most is that we've literally heard in the past several months Donald Trump say things like Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. Based on this court ruling today and what his lawyers argued in the court previously, that if he used SEAL Team 6 to assassinate an opponent, that it would perhaps fall under his quote-unquote core constitutional power, which is a language the court used today, to save the country from democracy. So based on what Trump's literally said, based on today's ruling, could he just go assassinate Joe Biden and then it just becomes a court trial, and guess where it lands? In the conservative Supreme Court. So these are the things that really should frighten the hell out of us, no?
Yeah, I think that, obviously that sounds far-fetched, but I mean, if you take the logic that we're debating here, you can see how it leads you to such a conclusion. In fact, that very scenario, the notion of a president ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political opponent came up during this case, came up in arguments, is part of the conversation here. And the idea that that's part of the conversation is mind-blowing, right? Now, I don't really think that means a president is going to do that, but it does suggest how much latitude a president would have under this logic to use his or her power for political gains without any consequence. And I think this is what we're really struggling with almost 250 years after the beginning of our constitutional republic, is how do we have accountability for a president of the United States, right? The founders tried to create a system in which there are checks and balances. They created, for instance, impeachment. They did create independent judiciary. And yet at this point now, we've seen impeachment's pretty useless as long as your own party will stick with you in the Senate. You're not going to get a 2/3 vote to convict. And the judiciary doesn't seem capable of dealing with a rogue president either. Here we are almost 4 years after the election that Donald Trump tried to overturn, right, an election. And we don't have a resolution, yes or no. Was this a criminal act or not? And we're not likely to get one now before voters have to decide whether he should go back to the Oval Office. So that's a big failure of accountability in the sense of not giving voters an understanding of, this person who might be their next president.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned the word far-fetched, and again, this is the part that really scares me and should scare the hell out of everybody in this country, is that to your point, the minute it was entered into the court discussion, it no longer became far-fetched. And B, what does the word far-fetched even mean anymore? If I said to you 9 years ago, before Trump, if I laid out a scenario and I said, here are 50 things a future president's going to do, you would have said, man, that shit's far-fetched, okay? Yeah. In retrospect, is it far-fetched that Donald Trump would literally do anything if it was self-serving and allowed him to stay in power for the rest of his life?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point out that the things we thought we understood about our government and our politics and the power of people that we elected 8 years ago no longer are the case, right? He showed through his 4 years in the White House that he could cross over all kinds of lines, bust all kinds of norms, defy all kinds of traditions, and there was no rule that actually made that impossible for him to do. That we only had been things that we thought were boundaries for a president were actually kind of advisory or, based on the character of the people that we elected in office, not actually based on any rules, hard and fast rules that can be enforced. So you're right about that. It used to be that every president released his tax returns. It used to be that every president, would never talk about terminating the Constitution. You would never have a president try to overturn an election that he lost. All of these things turn out, hey, why not, right? Because if you're brazen enough to try it, then it turns out there's nothing to stop you.
Yeah, or have what you consider to be a legit conversation about using the U.S. military to assassinate your political opponents.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insanity.
He's made very clear, even if he's not going after opponents individually, he has talked about prosecuting them, and he has, of course, talked about using the military in the streets to quell street protests that he doesn't particularly like and that he argues are somehow illegitimate. So, the rules and the standards and the boundaries are very, very fluid at this point.
I just got to point out, because this is audio only, I got to point out for my listeners that you have a really cute dog on a couch behind you. And like a minute ago, he looked up, literally looked right at us, and the look on his face was like, we're so screwed.
Yeah, can you believe that?
Like he's like, you guys could talk about this stuff all you want, but I'm telling you, we're totally screwed. So former President George W. Bush's political and legal teams argued the unitary executive theory, which holds that the U.S. president possesses the power to control the entire federal executive branch. Has this ruling today kind of leapfrogged over that and ushered in the imperial presidency? The Biden administration says the decision gives Trump, quote, the keys to the dictatorship. Are those exaggerations in your opinion?
It's a good question, because what is your check on a president who goes beyond what we consider to be the norms anymore? I mean, Congress has made clear they can't, right? If you're Donald Trump, are you going to worry about being impeached? No. You've already survived 2 impeachments. By the way, you've survived, if he gets back in office, at that point, he'll survive 4 indictments and even a conviction on 34 felonies. He's not going to be worried about, somebody challenging him or trying to hold him accountable for violating rules. And I think that's the concern you hear from a lot of people. Where is accountability these days, if not from the fear of prosecution? That was the one thing that seemed left to be a check on a president who goes too far.
The initial thinking is that this decision could have major impact on what Democratic presidents do as well. But then you start thinking, well, given how politicized this court has become, aren't we just going to be in a situation where as long as the court remains a conservative court, when it's a Republican president, they'll rule one way, and when it's a Democratic president, they'll rule another way?
Yeah, that's the fear about right now about the Supreme Court is that its credibility as an independent institution, not beholden to political party or figures, is in question by a lot of Americans. Polls certainly show that, and when you see splits like today, the six justices appointed by Republicans going one way, basically siding with Trump, and three justices appointed by Democrats going the other way against Trump, it feels to a lot of Americans that this is just one more political body, not that much different than Congress or something else. And I think that is a real cost for the court. I think that's something actually Chief Justice Roberts over the years has expressed concern about, but it's either beyond him or he's not sensing it in this particular decision. And I think I would not have expected. Well, I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I'm not sure what I expect anymore with the Supreme Court. I thought I used to understand it better than I do now.
Mm-hmm. Well, to your point, like we saw how swiftly they ruled on the Colorado ballot issue. This took 6 months, I think.
Yep.
How are we supposed to reconcile that amount of time and where they waited to the absolute last minute? How are we supposed to reconcile that this isn't a political maneuver?
I mean, it looks like that, right? That's whether it is or not, they've certainly created or fostered that impression. You're absolutely right. When the court took up U.S. v. Nixon, the question of whether or not Nixon had to turn over the tapes that ultimately led to his downfall during Watergate, they managed to do that in a space of a few days and weeks. They understood that there was urgency and that they needed to act decisively and quickly. And by the way, they acted unanimously. And it was, in fact, Nixon's own appointees who joined an 8-0 majority in that case because they thought that institutionally it was important that the Supreme Court speak with one voice and that a president of the United States not be above the law. That was the U.S. v. Nixon case. In this case, as you point out, it looks like a partisan division, and it looks like they took their time on it in a way that made it impossible for any kind of trial to take place before the election. And whether that was their intent or not, it certainly is the impression that a lot of people are going to be left with, which only, again, erodes, I think, the credibility of the court that we'll see. I would imagine we'll see some polls in the coming days about this.
Mm-hmm. So I want to use my next question to segue into the other big news of this week, which, of course, was the debate and the fallout from it. Does this ruling today raise the stakes even further in terms of whether President Joe Biden should stay in the race or not, especially if one of the foundations of his campaign is the existential threat of Donald Trump to our democracy?
Well, I think it certainly reminds you of the stakes of the election, right? And I think for Democrats, that's why this period has been so painful, because they like Joe Biden. It's not that they're anti-Joe Biden, even as a lot of them think he ought to drop out. The fear is that Joe Biden can't beat Donald Trump. And that is motivating, I think, a lot of the Democrats I talk to. Mm-hmm. It's not a matter of like, are they unhappy with Biden? They just don't think that he can win anymore. And they worry that if he can't win, then you are turning the Oval Office back over to Donald Trump, and in an environment in which the Supreme Court has just said, have at it in a lot of ways, and will worry, people who already felt persecuted by him in his first 4 years when he was a more restrained president. This next time, if he becomes president again, he's not going to have the people around him who were more conventional establishment Republicans and talked him out of doing things that were, that they thought were extreme. He's going to have the people who are full MAGA and are encouraging him to follow his instincts. And I think that you'll see a very different presidency at that point. So that, you're right, that hovers over this whole conversation as to whether or not President Biden should continue in the race.
So I want to ask you to qualify, not naming names, but just qualify the type of Democrats you've been talking to. Because if we look at the early polling, which is not terribly indicative yet, but early polling does indicate there is a majority of voters who would rather him stay in than leave. His family, which everyone is saying, like, they're the ones that can, Joe Biden, she's like, we're in it. We're not going anywhere. Joe Biden, we saw him in North Carolina. He's certainly not going anywhere. Surrogates, aides, there's so many people that are still behind him. Who are the people that someone like you was talking to that believes he should? Is there a public opinion that's being put out there versus a private opinion, perhaps that we don't see that you might be seeing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people aren't willing to be public with their names attached, and you can therefore credit or not credit it as a result. They're not willing to put their names attached. You're certainly entitled to draw a conclusion about that. But it is fair to say that every Democrat I speak with who's not on the payroll, and some who are on the payroll, is deeply devastated by what happened on Thursday. And in the majority of them think that I've talked to think that it would be better for him to think about whether it's time to step down. Now, they recognize all of the trade-offs there. Part of the trade-off is there's no obvious successor who is a sure bet to beat Donald Trump either. So it's kind of a roll of the dice, right? What you hear from a lot of Democrats is it more of a roll of the dice to stick with Joe Biden, knowing what we saw on Thursday is not going to be something that can be completely fixed, but still thinking there's a chance that he beats Trump, versus throwing the dice on an untested figure, Kamala Harris, or Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, whoever, and think that they could come in at the very last minute, 5 weeks before the roll call vote, and put on a strong case for beating Donald Trump. And that's which of these roll of dice are you willing to take? And that's where the Democrats are.
Yeah, I mean, you raised so many interesting points there. Number one of the biggest reasons that we're hearing about people urging him to step aside is legacy. Okay, do you want to be the guy that goes from being an amazing first-term, productive first-term president to the guy who cost us the election? Okay, but just sticking with that for a second, look at it from the opposite perspective. What if he leaves and there's chaos for the next 6 weeks before the convention, and then the convention itself is chaotic, and then we lose in the fall? Like, that's not going to be good for his legacy. So he's in a no-win position, in my opinion, if the issue is legacy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if the Democrats lose this fall, whether it's him or some other candidate, that will be on his marker. And I think that's why a lot of people were sorry that he didn't make a decision maybe a year and a half ago that was different than the one he made. That they argue that he could have, at the beginning of 2023, let's say, said, I'm going to focus on being the best one-term president I can be. I told you I was going to be a transition figure, a bridge to the next generation. I'm going to do that. I'm going to help groom the next person who's going to come along to take on Donald Trump. And that would have been a different situation. There would have been a process in which the next generation of Democrats would have competed with each other through the primaries, and they would have been tested. And we would have seen which one of them had talent and skill and ability and which ones didn't, right? They always look good until they get into the boxing ring. We saw that on the other side with DeSantis and the Republican side. He was a star. The Republicans loved him. They thought he was great until he actually got out there on the campaign trail, and it turned out he wasn't. And I think that without that chance for the Democrats to build up a new successor, then you have created a situation, Biden in effect has created his own situation where people argue that he has to stay in because there is no alternative. And why is there no alternative? Because that's the situation he created.
Yeah. And taking it a step further is the other issue that I'm not sure I've heard many people, if any people, talk about, which is Democrats can get excited all they want about Gavin Newsom and his great hair and all that. Josh Shapiro, I'm a Jew. I'd love to see a Jewish president, okay, in my lifetime, right? But for those two guys, and even for Gretchen Whitmer, you got to bypass the black woman. You got to say to her, you've paid your dues these last 4 years. You are vice president. You are next in line. But sorry, we're making room for a white man or a white woman because you're not good enough. Yeah. And if you think Democrats have a coalition problem now with young voters or voters of color, that would be suicide, wouldn't it?
I think it's a big question. You're absolutely right. It's the one reason why all the sort of fanciful talk about how Biden should have replaced her on the ticket was nonsense. He was never going to do that. It would have offended, as you say, a very loyal constituency and not gained him any other votes as a result. Now, if he or somebody were to try to, let's say, anoint somebody other than her, then I agree there would probably be a lot of backlash on that. If, on the other hand, it's an open competition and she has a chance to make her case and she's given a fair shot, and if Democratic voters and delegates choose not to, that is not voters so much as delegates, although they might respond to, voter polls. If the delegates choose not to go with her but go with somebody else, you're right. I think there'll be some sour feelings about that, but at least then it's a competition. She didn't get very far when she ran for president. She didn't even make it to the first presidential primary, and it's not because somebody else, told her she couldn't is because she didn't catch on with Democratic primary voters and she had to drop out. So if she had the chance to compete and she has the opportunity, and by the way, she may do well. She may be the one who gets the nomination. She may be able to make that argument. I'm the next in line. I've been here for 4 years. I'm the closest you got to somebody ready to do this. She's got a case to make. No question about it.
American University history professor and presidential historian Alan Lichtman, who's accurately predicted pretty much every presidential election since 1984. He said today on CNN that Biden dropping out would not only be a huge mistake, but would cost Democrats the election in November. Should the powers that be listening to Professor Lichtman?
I hadn't seen that, but that's really interesting. You're right. He's got a great track record. And what he bases his projections on are a series of keys, he calls them, I think, that are the same for each election. So he's not trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat and make it up each time. He's saying, okay, where's the economy? That's one key. How charming or magnetic or personable is the candidate? That's another candidate. Polls, all these other things. Of these factors, he says, if X number show this way, that predicts who will be. And so he has a very tried and true, method. And if he says that, obviously, it wouldn't surprise me for elected officials to take that seriously. So far, you've not seen any current major elected officials openly say that the president should drop out. They have offered him support, but I would say it's kind of tepid, honestly. And they've kind of left their cards a little bit close to the vest. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi on MSNBC yesterday said, I'm not abandoning Joe Biden right now. And of course, it's hard not to hear the words right now in that sentence. Now, when we pushed that, I got an angry rocket from Pelosi's office saying, no, you're reading too much into it. But, she said the words. And I think that, it does feel like it's still an unsettled question at this point, whether he stays in or not. I think most people think he's likely to. The odds I've heard are, 80% likely to. But as one person told me yesterday, I know what today's decision is. I don't know what tomorrow's decision is.
Right. In contrast to your newspaper's editorial board, which called for Biden to quit, the Philadelphia Inquirer editorial board came out with this call, quote, to serve his country, Donald Trump should leave the race. Given the reasons they cite, including racism, corruption, threats to democracy, how important is it that we balance what happened with Biden Thursday night with the myriad dangers of another Trump presidency? In other words, is it not only unfair and myopic, but dangerous to judge Biden in this vacuum? Because to be honest, the discussion so far seems to be extremely one-sided.
Well, just first of all, to be clear, as a reporter on the news side of the New York Times, I have nothing to do with our editorials.
Absolutely.
For our listeners here. It's a completely different section, very independent. I've been at the New York Times for 16 years. Not only have I not anything to do with the editorials, I have in 16 years not read any of the editorials, so I can keep my reporting completely separate and independent from whatever the editorial people want to say. So just want to be clear about that. But I think, I think that the point that you make is one you're hearing a lot from the people who are for Biden and say, look, you know what? It's a pipe dream to suggest anybody else can come in at this point. And if that's the case, if this is your candidate, it may not be who you would have preferred, but he is your candidate. And given the threat on the other side, get in line. And that's the line you're hearing, I think, from a lot of Biden people at this point. I think if we get to the point where people feel like his decision to stay in is irrevocable, that it is in fact solid, you'll hear a lot more Democrats, saying that, even the ones who have their doubts. But for the moment, the ones who are thinking he should drop out or not thinking he should drop out of any desire to make it easier for Trump to get in, it's the other way around. It's because they think that that him staying on the ticket is the way that Trump gets into office, and that's something that they would like to avoid. So it's a disagreement about the best way to beat Trump, not over whether or not they should be focusing on Trump.
In our last couple of minutes here, I got 3 quick questions for you, so 3 quick answers. Who do you think is going to be his vice presidential choice, Trump? What do you think the impact of RFK is? And what do you think the impact of debate/conviction will be on this election?
Well, 3 really good questions. On the vice president, we should all know not to predict Donald Trump. He is, of course, his own most impulsive, unpredictable self. I've been struck by Doug Burgum just because I think that he is a couple of things that Trump likes. One is he's rich, and 2 is he doesn't show up Trump. He's not going to have so much flash that he overshadows him. And 3, he might be seen as loyal in a way that Trump decided Mike Pence wasn't, right? Mike Pence was loyal 3 years, 360 some days until the last minute when he found one red line he couldn't cross. What Trump wants this time is somebody who is going to be doing exactly what he wants all the way through the end, no matter how much it might challenge the rules or so forth. But there are other people. I mean, J.D. Vance, I think, is a very viable, choice for him. I find it hard to believe he's going to pick Marco Rubio, given the history there. That doesn't seem really to make a lot of sense. But again, and Marco would not, you in theory, think, be more loyal than Mike Pence in a situation that they wanted to. Marco Rubio, if I remember correctly, voted to certify the election. So I don't know that that's something that Trump can get past. Tim Scott, same. Maybe, he also voted to certify the election. So, it's possible there's somebody we're not thinking about, and he's going to surprise us all.
Yeah, that's my vote.
One thing that's clear, I think he'll stretch it out all the way to the convention to keep the suspense going, because remember, that's the reality show guy we've got here. How do you keep him coming back for more?
And RFK, quickly?
RFK, total jump ball, right? And I don't know whether the debate changes that. Do some Democrats who are disaffected from Biden because of the debate decide that RFK Jr. is somehow an acceptable alternative, even though there's a lot of Trump quality to RFK Jr.? Hard to say. The polls up until before the debate show a kind of a mixed bag, like either A, no effect on the bottom line, or B, in some states a little bit pro-Trump, in some states a little pro-Biden. Very much uncertain. I think Cornell West and Jill Stein arguably may be more of a problem for Biden because they obviously take away from his vote if they're on the ballot.
And does the convicted felon thing outweigh a 90-minute bad debate?
Well, we're going to see. I mean, clearly the conviction hurt Trump only modestly. It did seem, if you look at the polls, to cost him a point, maybe 2 points in the polls. Not very much. You don't need very much, of course, in the right states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the 3 that really matter. You only need in those states a very small shift in the votes to decide it. But it didn't seem to have a cataclysmic effect on him. And it's possible, by the way, this debate doesn't have a cataclysmic effect on Biden. You certainly hear some people say that the horse race numbers may not change all that much because it's already baked in. People already knew that he was old. They already knew in many cases that they either did or didn't want him. Depending on that. And they already knew that they didn't like Trump or did like Trump, depending on what their view was. So it's possible that this doesn't actually change the bottom line all that much. That's where everybody's waiting right now. And that's what will, I think, finally decide for Biden whether he stays in or not. If the polls really were to crater, particularly if these down ballot candidates feel themselves at risk and the donors start to melt away, the situation could be different. If the polls in the next few days turn out to be not so bad, obviously they don't think he won the election or won the debate, but is still, more or less even or close to even with Trump, he could probably survive.
Last question. I suspect this may not have been asked of you before. It's a window into the soul question. What better way to get a window into someone's soul is through music? Give me your top 5 musical artists of all time.
Top 5 musical artists of all time? That's a great question. I'll tell you the ones that we listen to all the time, if that's okay. How about that? We listen to Fleetwood Mac. We listen to ABBA. We listen to the Big Chill soundtrack.
Oh, God, that's the second time in 24 hours I got that.
Is that right?
Yes.
We love Motown, we love Billy Joel, Elton John. We're pretty old, I guess.
All good stuff. Peter, this was great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you come back and talk to us again.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.